9 translators had refused the assignment in the span of 4 days, not quit, refused. Each one received the same call, the same address, the same fee, and each one declined before the line went cold. The 9th sent back a single sentence, 11 words long, that reached Dominic Calder the following morning through his assistant's trembling voice. "Tell Mr. Calder that some doors are not meant to open for him." 11 words. Dominic counted them. Then he counted the years he had spent building a logistics empire across 6 countries by opening precisely the doors that other people declared shut. He put the phone down without answering and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 43rd floor office, watching the city below arrange itself into patterns of movement and light, all of it purposeful, all of it legible to him. And the one thing he could not read was the silence of a man named Seok Jin-woo, who sat somewhere in this city inside a compound Dominic had never been permitted to enter, controlling the single port corridor that Dominic needed to make his Pacific expansion real. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Dominic needed that corridor. He had needed it for 11 months, which was exactly how long his Pacific expansion plan had been, a locked document on a server that only 4 people could access. And in those 11 months, he had arranged 4 formal introductions through institutional intermediaries, engaged 2 law firms with connections to the relevant regional chambers, hired the 9 translators, and accomplished nothing except the sentence. Some doors are not meant to open for him. He kept returning to it not because it wounded him, though it did, but because it was the first piece of real information he had received in 11 months, and real information, however unflattering, was always worth examining. He was 48 years old. He had built Calder Meridian Logistics from a single bonded warehouse in a port city into a company that moved freight across 6 continents, employed 4,300 people, and generated revenues that analysts described, without irony, as significant. He did not lack for competence, for reach, or for the particular quality of restrained authority that caused people in rooms to orient toward him. What he lacked, the 11-word sentence was suggesting, was something he had not yet been forced to name. He did not name it that morning. He went instead to his 9 o'clock, a board alignment meeting that ran efficiently and concluded on time, because Dominic Calder's meetings always concluded on time, and he moved through the rest of the day, performing each obligation with the precision of a man who has trained himself to treat uncertainty as administrative rather than existential. He did not think about Seok Jin-woo during the 9 o'clock. He thought about him during the 3 o'clock briefly, when a freight variance report crossed his desk, and the Pacific corridor appeared as a gap in projected capacity, a blank space in a spreadsheet that would remain blank until it was filled. And he thought about him again at 6:15 when he was signing off on the day's final correspondence, and noticed in passing that the stack had been organized, annotated, and cross-referenced in a way that reduced his review time by approximately 20 minutes. He noticed it the way he noticed the temperature of the room or the quality of the light. He noticed it and did not remark upon it and moved on. Her name was Clara Voss. She had worked as the night building supervisor at Calder Meridian's headquarters for 3 years and 2 months. Her title in the company directory read Facility Operations Coordinator, Night Shift, which was accurate the way a weather report is accurate when it tells you the temperature, but not the quality of the air. What the title did not say was that Clara Voss arrived every evening at 9 o'clock and departed every morning at 6, and that in those 9 hours she managed not only the physical facility, but a quiet parallel operation that Dominic had never formally authorized because he had never formally noticed it. She had, over 3 years, established a working relationship with the building's overnight security team that had reduced incident reports by 61%. She had identified a recurring data entry error in the night shift freight logs that, when corrected, saved the company an estimated $42,000 annually in misfiled duty claims. She had twice intercepted maintenance contractors who were billing for work they had not performed and had documented both cases with the quiet thoroughness of someone who does not expect to be thanked for noticing. She had not been thanked. She had been, on both occasions, briefly acknowledged by a deputy operations manager who passed her reports upward without attribution, and the matter had concluded there. She also spoke Korean. Not conversationally, not instrumentally, not in the transactional way that people speak languages they have learned for professional utility. She spoke it completely with the specific gravity and tonal register that native speakers recognize in the first sentence a person produces, the quality that cannot be performed, only lived. She had spent 4 years in Seoul as a young woman studying architectural heritage preservation, had worked alongside Korean colleagues for another 2 years in a documentation project covering traditional structural methods, had kept the language alive through the private discipline of a person who tends to things not because they are watched, but because the tending matters. 6 years in total in the language and the life it carried. Dominic did not know this. He had never asked. She was, in his organizational map, a fixture of the building's overnight infrastructure, as present and as unremarked as the HVA system that kept the temperature regulated while he slept. She left him a note on a Tuesday. Not an email, not a message through the internal system. A note, handwritten, placed precisely at the center of the correspondence stack she had organized between a freight contract amendment and a regulatory response he was supposed to sign. The note said, "I may be able to help with the Suk Jin-woo situation. If you want to discuss it, I will be in the facilities office until 5:30 tomorrow morning." The note was signed with her name and her employee number, as though she expected him to need to look her up. He found it at 6:50 on a Wednesday morning. He read it once, put it aside, read his email, read it again. His first response, the one he did not examine, was mild irritation at the presumption. His second response, the one he examined very briefly before the 7:30 began, was to wonder how she knew about Seok Jin-woo at all, given that the Pacific expansion file was access controlled to 4 executives and no one else. His third response did not arrive until the 7:30 was underway, and a deputy was walking through a supply chain projection that Dominic could follow with half his attention. And the third response was this. She said she may be able to help, not that she had a contact or a connection or a strategy. She said may. The precision of that word caught him the way the 11 words had caught him, differently, but with the same quality of carrying information. He did not go to the facilities office that morning. 5:30 had already passed. He told himself he would follow up through the appropriate channel, which meant his assistant, which meant a meeting request, which meant Thursday at the earliest, possibly Friday, possibly the following week, depending on the schedule compression that always accompanied month end. He told himself this and believed it. And then at 9:15 on Wednesday night, he walked down 4 floors to the facilities office himself because the building was quiet and his executive floor felt, in that particular hour, very large and very empty. And he found the light on and clairvoyant at her desk with 3 monitors displaying what appeared to be facility management software, maintenance logs, and a translation document he could not read from the doorway. She looked up when he knocked on the open door frame. She did not look surprised. She looked, he would think later, like someone who had arranged for a thing to happen and was waiting, without impatience, for the thing to happen. You found the note, she said. I found it this morning. You didn't come at 5:30? No. She nodded as though this confirmed a piece of data she already possessed. Sit down if you want. He sat. He was aware distantly of the slight strangeness of a man who owned the building sitting in a functional metal chair in a basement facilities office while a woman he had never held a real conversation with returned her attention briefly to her monitors before folding her hands on the desk with the manner of someone who has decided to give their full attention to a thing and means it. How do you know about Seok Jin-woo? He said. Maintenance contractors talk, she said. So do freight managers when they're working late and don't think anyone can hear them from the utility corridor. I've known about the Pacific Corridor gap for about 7 months. The name Seok Jinwoo came up 3 months ago. He absorbed this, the utility corridor. 7 months. What did you mean by may be able to help? I meant exactly that. I'm not certain, but I speak Korean, not for business purposes. I speak it the way a person speaks a language they lived in. She paused. The 9 translators you hired spoke it for business purposes. That's a different thing. How do you know about the 9 translators? Same way I knew about the corridor gap, she said. People talk. I listen. He looked at her for a moment in the flat fluorescent light of the facilities office, this woman who had organized his correspondence for 3 years and corrected 61% of his security incidents and intercepted 2 fraudulent contractors, and lived 6 years inside the Korean language and listened from utility corridors, with a precision he was not used to feeling, the specific weight of something he had failed to see. What would you need, he said. I'd need you to make one call, she said. Not to Seok Jinwoo's office, to his personal intermediary. I'll tell you what to say and when to stop talking. Then I'd need to attend the meeting, if there is a meeting, as something other than a translator. As what? As someone whose judgment you trust. She said it plainly without loading it, and it landed with the weight of a plain, declarative truth. He said nothing for a moment. Then, I don't know you well enough to say that convincingly. I know, she said. You have until Thursday. I'll leave you materials on your desk tonight. She unfolded her hands and returned to her monitors. The conversation was finished in a way that she had decided, not him. He left. In the elevator back to the 43rd floor, he stood very still and thought about what it meant that the most direct conversation he had had in 11 months of failed strategy had lasted 7 minutes and had been conducted in a basement. He thought about the materials she would leave on his desk. He thought about the word trust, the way she had said it without softness, as though it were a logistical requirement rather than an emotional appeal. The materials were on his desk when he arrived at 7 the following morning, not a folder. 3 separate documents, each with a cover page that identified its contents in precise, minimal language. The first was a briefing on Seok Jinwoo's professional history, his organizational structure, his known negotiating principles, and his documented responses to Western business approaches, which she had annotated with specific behavioral observations drawn from published academic and trade sources all cited. 41 pages. The second was a phonetic and contextual script for the introductory call, with marginal notes explaining not just what each phrase meant, but why each phrase would land differently than its nearest English equivalent, the notes written in the tone of someone translating culture rather than language. 17 pages. The third document was 8 pages long and contained nothing about Seok Jinwoo. It was a structured summary of 3 things Clara Voss had noticed during her 3 years in the building that had direct financial or legal implications for Calder Meridian Logistics, each documented with dates, names of individuals involved, and supporting evidence drawn from maintenance logs, contractor invoices, and freight records that she had apparently been cross-referencing in her own time. The $42,000 in misfiled duty claims was on page 1. The 2 fraudulent contractors were on pages 3 and 5. On page 7 was something he had not expected. A pattern of small, methodical discrepancies in the Pacific Division's freight authorization records going back 14 months, totaling, when the figures were aggregated, just under $280,000. The discrepancies were consistent, regular, and almost invisible, unless you were looking from the angle of the facility logs rather than the financial system, which was exactly the angle Clara Voss occupied at 9 o'clock every night. He read page 7 twice, then he read it again. The name that appeared in connection with the pattern was not a contractor or a vendor, it was an internal name, a senior name. a name that belonged to a man called Garrett Shen, who was Dominic Calder's chief operating officer and had been for 6 years, who had been on his executive committee since the company's $40 million revenue milestone, who had attended Dominic's 44th birthday dinner, who had been copied on every version of the Pacific expansion file, and who had, Dominic now understood in a cold, still, reorganizing instant, been on every call with the institutional intermediaries who had failed to arrange an introduction to Seok Jin-woo. He sat with that for a long time. The office was filling with morning light, slow and gray through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and outside the city was beginning its patterns of movement. And Dominic Calder sat very still at his desk with page 7 in front of him and did not move for 11 minutes, which was how long it took for the full architecture of what he was looking at to assemble itself into something he could hold as fact rather than suspicion. Garrett Shen had been blocking the Pacific corridor, not failing to open it, blocking it. The distinction was the distance between incompetence and strategy. Everything Dominic had attributed to the difficulty of the negotiation, to cultural barriers, to the natural resistance of a private organization to outside approach, everything he had managed and arranged and worked around, had been happening on a stage whose backdrop was a man in his own building quietly ensuring that the door stayed closed. He needed to know more before he moved. That was his first principle, the one that had saved him from every costly mistake in his professional life. Never move on a belief, move on a fact with a second fact underneath it. He needed the second fact. He did not have it yet. What he had was Clara Voss's document, which was meticulous and damning, and also crucially not yet formally produced through any system or institution that could give it standing. He needed someone who could verify the pattern independently, move without leaving a trace inside the company, and report back through a channel that Garrett Shen could not access. He had exactly one person who fit that description, a man named Oluskan Dare, who operated as an external compliance investigator and who had done 2 pieces of work for Calder Meridian in the previous 4 years, always on a direct mandate from Dominic personally. Always with a written scope that kept his access narrow and his findings confidential, until Dominic decided what to do with them. He called Oluskan at 7:48. He gave him 3 sentences of instruction. He said, look at Pacific Division freight authorizations, 14 months back. Look for consistency in the discrepancy pattern and do not speak to anyone inside the building until you speak to me. Oluskan said, I'll need 72 hours. Dominic said, 60. Oluskan said nothing for a moment. Then, 60. That left the question of Seok Jin-woo, which had not become simpler. If Garrett Shen had been blocking the introduction, the question was how he had done it. The institutional intermediaries, the law firms, the chambers of commerce contacts, any or all of them, could have been quietly discouraged by a word from someone inside Calder Meridian who appeared to be managing the approach on Dominic's behalf. That was the elegant cruelty of it. Dominic had delegated the operational management of the approach to Garrett because Dominic always delegated operational management and focused on strategic direction, and Garrett had managed the approach methodically and invisibly into the ground. He went back to the facilities office at 10 on Thursday morning. Clara was there, which surprised him for a moment before he calculated that she would have worked until 6 and returned at 9 to accommodate whatever he might need before her night shift. She had slept, he assumed, somewhere in between, though he could not say where. You read it, she said. Page 7, he said. Yes. How long have you been sitting on this? She considered the question. I've had the pattern confirmed in my own files for about 5 months. I waited because I wasn't certain of the right moment and because I didn't have access to you. You could have emailed me. I could have, she said, but you would have forwarded it to your COO for review. She said it without cruelty, as a plain logistical observation. And it was exactly true, and they both knew it. He sat down. Same metal chair. I need the Seok Jin-woo meeting to happen before I move on the internal matter, he said. If I move on Garrett first, he'll know something has shifted, and he'll take steps I can't predict. If I secure the corridor first, his leverage disappears before he understands. The ground has changed. She nodded slowly. Then we need to make the call today. Walk me through it. What followed was an hour he would remember for a long time, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite. Clara Voss sat across from him in the facilities office with the phonetic script and a notepad and walked him through the call structure the way a very good architect walks a client through a building. Here's the entrance. Here is the weight-bearing element. Here's the room you must not rush through, because rushing it will compromise everything that comes after. She explained that the opening phrase was a formal acknowledgement of organizational standing that had no clean English equivalent, that using it would signal to Seok Jin-woo's intermediary, that the approach understood its own posture, that the intermediary's response would contain a word whose position in the sentence would indicate whether the door was being opened a fraction or remaining closed, and that the correct reply to the open fraction position was silence of approximately 3 seconds, followed by a single question containing exactly the word she wrote on the notepad, underlined. She then said, "The worst thing you can do is fill the silence. Every time you've filled silence in this negotiation, you've sent the wrong message." He looked at her. "You don't know what I've said in those conversations?" "No," she said, "but I know what the responses have been, and I know what filling silence communicates in this specific context." She paused. "It communicates that you need something, which you do, but the moment they know you need it, the price becomes unlimited." The call was made at 2:15 on Thursday afternoon from Dominic's office, which felt, after the past 18 hours, slightly unreal to him in its curated authority, its leather and glass and view. Clara sat across the desk, not at his shoulder, not with headphones, but directly across from him. Watching his face, he made the call. He produced the opening phrase, which he had practiced 6 times in the facilities office, and which felt in his mouth like an artifact from a language he had borrowed rather than owned, but which came out with enough accuracy that the intermediary on the other end of the call did not pause before responding. He listened, he heard the word. Its position in the sentence was the position Clara had described as the open fraction. He waited 3 seconds. He asked the question with exactly the word she had underlined. There was a pause on the other end that lasted perhaps 8 seconds, which was a very long time in a phone silence, and then the intermediary said in Korean a phrase that Clara, watching his face, mouthed to him in English 2 seconds before he heard it, because she had anticipated it. He will meet. He will meet 3 words. He had spent 11 months and 9 translators and 4 institutional introductions arriving at 3 words, and they had arrived in a facilities office on a Thursday afternoon in the presence of a woman he had not spoken to in 3 years of working in the same building. He set the phone down. He looked at Clara. She was already writing on the notepad. "The meeting will be proposed for 10 days from now," she said. "They'll choose the venue, and it will not be in this city. When the venue confirmation comes, bring it to me immediately. The room matters." Why does the room matter? Because where you sit and where I sit, and what that arrangement says without words, will determine whether the first 20 minutes land as a negotiation between equals or as a request. She looked up. "I assume you'd prefer the former." "I've only ever operated as an equal," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I'm saying the room needs to know that too." He left the facilities office and went back to the 43rd floor and stood at the window and thought about the word that Clara Voss had been demonstrating, without naming it, since the note appeared in his correspondence stack. The word was attention. She paid attention. Not curated attention, not strategic attention, not the managed focus of a person scanning an environment for their own advantage. Absolute attention, given to things, regardless of whether anyone was watching or whether the thing being attended to appeared in any register of importance. She had paid attention to freight logs and utility corridors and contractor invoices and a negotiation she had no official role in and a language she had kept alive through 6 years of living and 2 more of private discipline. And all of that attention had arrived eventually. At this, a door that 11 months and 9 translators and 4 institutional introductions had failed to opened in a Thursday afternoon phone call that lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He thought about what that said. He stayed with what it said for a long time. 62 hours later, at 7 in the morning on Saturday, Olusegun Dare called. He said, "It's confirmed, the pattern is real, I have 14 months of authorization records with the variant signatures, and there's a secondary trail you didn't tell me to look for that, I found anyway, because it was sitting next to the one you did tell me to look for, and you need to know about it." Dominic said, "Tell me." Olusegun said, "The Pacific Corridor discrepancies are the surface layer. Underneath them, going back 22 months, there are a series of freight route modifications in the Southeast Asia Division that have been systematically redirecting small volume, high value cargo consignments to a third-party consolidator whose ownership structure, if you trace it through 2 holding companies, includes a beneficial interest registered to an entity connected to Garrett Shen's brother-in-law." Dominic said nothing. He was standing at the kitchen window of his apartment with coffee going cold in his hand and morning light on the street outside, and he did not move or speak for nearly a minute, and Olusegun waited in professional silence on the other end of the line because he understood that some information requires the room it takes. 22 months. The calculation arrived unbidden and precise. 22 months back placed the beginning of this at the same month Dominic had formally announced the Pacific expansion internally at an all-hands meeting attended by every senior leader, including Garrett Shen, who had stood in the 3rd row and had later, over drinks, told Dominic it was the best strategic vision he had articulated since the Southeast Asia consolidation, which was the division where the secondary trail began. Dominic had thanked him. He remembered thanking him. He remembered the specific warmth of being affirmed by someone you had trusted for 6 years. He said, "How quickly can you produce a formal report that would support a regulatory referral?" Olusegun said, 36 hours if I work straight." Dominic said, "Work straight." Olusegun said, "There's something else." Dominic waited. Garrett Shen made a call this morning at 5:42 a.m. to 3 members of your board of directors. Olusegun paused. "I don't know the content of the calls, but the timing is specific enough to interest me." The timing interested Dominic more than it interested Olusegun. 5:42 on a Saturday morning was not a social call. It was a preemptive call. It was the call of a man who had detected or suspected that something had shifted and who was moving to establish a position before the shift became visible. The question was what Garrett suspected. The answer was possibly nothing specific, possibly the Shat Jinwoo situation, which had been access controlled to 4 executives, including Garrett, and which had just in the past 48 hours moved without Garrett's involvement for the first time in 11 months. Garrett was precise and controlled, and he paid the kind of attention that calculated, and he may have felt the ground change simply through the absence of a call from Dominic about the Pacific Corridor status, which Dominic had made every Thursday for 3 months and had not made this Thursday because he had been sitting in the facilities office. He was moving, then, toward the board, toward the inside, toward a position that if it landed before Olusegun's report was complete, could be used to muddy the ground sufficiently that a formal referral would look, to people who did not have the underlying documents, like a power dispute rather than an evidence-based action. Dominic made 4 calls in the next 40 minutes. The first was to the company's external legal counsel, a firm that had no relationship with Garrett Shen, to initiate a document preservation notice covering all freight authorization records going back 24 months. The second was to the company's audit committee chair, a board member named Priscilla Tan, who had been appointed by institutional shareholders precisely because of her independence from management and who answered at 8:15 with the measured alertness of someone who had already received an unusual Saturday morning call and was not surprised to receive another. He did not tell her everything. He told her enough that he had reason to believe there were material irregularities in freight authorization records, that he had engaged an external investigator, that a preliminary report was expected within 36 hours, and that he was formally requesting that the audit committee convene an extraordinary session upon receipt of the report before any management personnel took any action involving board communications on related matters. Priscilla Tan said, "I'll need the investigator's mandate in writing by this afternoon," he said. "You have it by noon." She said, "Dominic, how serious?" He said, "Serious enough that I called you before 9 a.m. on a Saturday." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said, "I'll manage the committee." The third call was to Oluskan, to authorize him to interface directly with the audit committee council. The fourth call was to Clara Voss on the facility's office line at 8:52 in the morning. She answered on the second ring. He had half expected her not to be there. She was there. "The internal situation is accelerating," he said. "Shen has made moves toward the board. I have 36 hours before I have an independent report that can stop it formally. I need the Suk Jinwoo meeting confirmed before that window closes, because if the board session happens first and the company goes into any kind of internal review status, the meeting gets delayed indefinitely." There was a pause. "How confident are you in the audit committee chair?" "Completely." "Then you have a path," she said. "I'll reach out to the intermediary today and ask to accelerate the venue confirmation. It will be an unusual request. Liz, I'll explain the timing constraint in terms that are accurate, but do not mention the internal situation." She paused. "There is a phrase in Korean for a man who must act before the ground settles. I'll use it. It communicates urgency without weakness if the relationship has the right foundation. After Thursday, it does." He said, "What do you need from me to make that call?" "Nothing from you," she said. "You've already done the part that was yours to do." He held the phone and thought about that sentence. "You've already done the part that was yours to do." He could not remember the last time someone had divided a task that way in his presence, assigning him a portion and then completing their own without requiring his direction. He could not remember, in fact, the last time he had been on the receiving end of competence that did not report to him. Days moved with the particular compression that real stakes produce, time not slower or faster, but denser. Each hour waited. The venue confirmation arrived Sunday at 11:40 in the morning. A meeting facility in a coastal city, 3 hours by air, 9 days away. In a building whose layout Clara studied for an hour, Sunday afternoon, and from which she produced by Sunday evening a seating and entry sequence that she walked him through with the same architectural precision she had used for the phone call script. She said, "You will enter before me. You will be seated when I arrive. I will be introduced as your operational advisor," which is accurate. "When I sit, I will sit to your left and slightly behind," which in this context reads as trust granted rather than hierarchy enforced. The distinction will register without being named. "And if Seok Jin-woo speaks directly to me in Korean," "He won't," she said. "Not at first. He'll speak through his own translator to test whether yours handles it accurately. The test will be in the idiom, not the content. I'll answer through you, not around you. The phrasing I use will show that I understand the idiom and that I'm not competing for the room. He'll know within 10 minutes. Know what? That you brought someone who was paying attention." She said it simply, as though it were a logistical specification, rather than a definition of everything that had gone wrong for 11 months. On Tuesday, Oluskan delivered the report. 31 pages structured for regulatory and legal review, with source documentation attached in a separate appendix of 47 pages. He sent it at 6:12 in the morning and called at 6:15 to say, there are three jurisdictional angles here, Dominic: domestic freight regulation, cross-border customs irregularity, and the corporate governance layer. All three are viable. The governance layer is the fastest. Dominic thanked him, which Oluskun acknowledged briefly, and the call ended. Dominic sent the report to Priscilla Tan at 6:20 and to external legal at 6:21, and sat at his desk in the early morning with the report on his screen and thought about 22 months, the duration during which a man he had trusted and elevated and included and thanked for his strategic vision had been redirecting small volume, high-value cargo to a holding structure 2 beneficial interest layers away from his own family, while simultaneously ensuring that the one expansion that would have rendered the diversion irrelevant to Calder, Meridian's future had no path to completion. Attention, he thought. The word again, Garrett Shen paid the wrong kind. The kind that calculated, that arranged, that managed visibility, that performed loyalty with the precision of someone who understood that performed loyalty, if sustained without error, becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. He had performed it for 6 years. Dominic had received the performance as the thing itself. That was the cost of the confusion. You stop distinguishing between the performed version and the real version because they look identical from the outside, and you have stopped looking from any other angle. Clara Voss had looked from the utility corridor. The audit committee convened on Wednesday in an extraordinary session that lasted 6 hours. Priscilla Tan ran it with the specific quality of self-possession that makes institutional processes feel like they are carrying their own weight rather than being pushed. External legal presented. Olusegun was present as the investigator. Dominic presented the circumstantial and contextual framing. Garrett Shen was not present. He had been informed at 8 a.m. Wednesday that an extraordinary audit committee session was convening and that his access to company systems had been suspended pending the session's conclusions, the notification delivered by external legal to ensure that it could not be characterized as a management action rather than a governance one. Dominic was told that Garrett had received the notification without visible reaction and had said only, "I'll need to speak with my counsel," which was the response of a man who had prepared a response in advance, which was consistent with everything else. The session concluded with a resolution to refer the matter to the relevant regulatory bodies across 2 of the 3 jurisdictions Oluskun had identified and to initiate an independent board-level investigation into the governance failures. It also concluded with a secondary resolution proposed by Priscilla Tan and seconded without dissent to commission an external review of Calder Meridian's internal reporting channels, specifically their accessibility to non-executive staff, the language of which Dominic recognized as a quiet institutional acknowledgement that someone outside the executive structure had seen something that everyone inside it had missed. He voted in favor without speaking. It was the right vote, and he knew it. What Garrett Shen did next surprised him, though it probably should not have. Rather than disengaging, rather than the quiet retreat of a man confronted with documented evidence of a sustained scheme, Garrett moved laterally. He called on Wednesday evening a meeting with 2 of the 3 board members he had reached Saturday morning at a private club in the city center, and he presented them with a counter-narrative. That the investigation had been initiated not out of genuine concern for company governance, but as a preemptive action by Dominic to neutralize a COO who had developed concerns about the Pacific expansion's risk profile and had been building a case internally for a change in strategic direction. It was a precise and plausible counter-narrative constructed to land with board members who had received Saturday's call and whose natural institutional instinct was to look for complexity when a situation appeared too clean. One of the 2 board members called Priscilla Tan at 10 Wednesday night to relay it. Priscilla called Dominic at 10:15. He was in the facilities office when the call came. Clara was there. He heard the counter-narrative through Priscilla's careful, neutral summary, and he looked across the desk at Clara while he listened. And when Priscilla finished, he said, "How many votes would Garrett need to call an emergency board session that could suspend the investigation?" Priscilla said, "He would need a majority. He doesn't have it, but he needs only 2 more members to agree that there is sufficient dispute to require a full board convening before the regulatory referral goes forward, and that buys him time." How much time? A formal full board meeting requires 14 days' notice under our articles. 14 days. That was the arithmetic. Garrett needed 2 board members and 14 days. Dominic had the Seok Jinwoo meeting in 6 days, and the regulatory referral, once submitted, would be largely outside anyone's ability to quietly suspend. The sequence mattered: referral before the full board meeting before the board had assembled in a configuration that Garrett had framed. He needed to move faster than 14 days allowed, and he needed the 2 wavering board members to hold. "I need to speak to both board members tonight," he said, directly. "Not through you. That's unusual," Priscilla said. "I know," he said. "Tell them it's important, not urgent. If I call it urgent, they'll think I'm panicking. Important means I have something to show them." "Do you?" He looked at Clara. "Yes," he said. He called each board member personally. The first, a man named Anton Vales, who had been on the board for 4 years and had a background in infrastructure development, answered at 11 p.m. with the carefully neutral tone of a man who had recently been told 2 different stories about the same situation and was waiting to see which one held more weight. Dominic spent 11 minutes with him. He did not disparage Garrett's narrative directly. He walked Anton through 3 specific items in Alusigan's report, the ones with the clearest evidentiary chain. And he said, "I'm not asking you to conclude anything tonight. I'm asking you to read pages 7 through 12 before the referral goes forward. After that, your judgment is your judgment, and I'll respect it." Anton said, "Send me the pages." Dominic did. The second board member was harder. A woman named Irene Scholl, who had a 15-year history with institutional shareholders and who, Dominic knew, had trusted Garrett Shen's operational competence more than she had trusted Dominic's expansionist strategy. She answered at 11:30 with a directness that he recognized as the directness of someone who had already made a tentative decision and was willing to be changed, but needed a reason that was not political. He gave her the specific figures: the 280,000 in Pacific Division discrepancies, the 22 months of Southeast Asia modifications, the beneficial interest chain. He gave them plainly, without inflection, because plain figures in a plain sequence carry more weight than any argument built around them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you find this yourself?" He paused. He said, "No." She said, "Who?" He said, "The person who is paying attention." She said, "I'd like to speak with them before the referral." He said, "I'll arrange it." He turned to Clara. "She wants to speak with you." Clara looked at him. "Before I do that?" She said, "I need to know something." "What?" "When this is over," she said, "and the meeting with Seok Jinwoo has happened, and the investigation has concluded, and the corridor is open, what changes?" He held her gaze. It was a plain question. The kind that deserves a plain answer, not a managed one. He thought about the 11 months, the 9 translators, the note in the correspondence stack, the utility corridor, the 61%, the 42,000, page 7, the phonetic script, the open fraction in the intermediary's sentence, and he said, "I don't have the right answer yet. I know that, but I know that what existed before was insufficient, and that naming it is the beginning of changing it." She studied him for a moment. "That's an honest answer," she said. "It's not a sufficient one." "No," he said, "it isn't." She nodded. I'll speak to your board member, she said. And then we need to prepare for the meeting in 6 days. The two things are not separate. Irene Scholl's call with Clara lasted 28 minutes. Dominic did not hear it. He sat outside the facilities office in the corridor, which was the appropriate place for that particular conversation, and he waited. And when Clara opened the door, she said, "She'll hold." That was all. 2 words. He did not need more. The regulatory referral went forward Thursday morning across 2 jurisdictions. The governance layer referral followed at noon, handled by the audit committee's counsel directly. By Thursday afternoon, Garrett Shen had disengaged from his effort to convene the full board, not because he lacked the desire, but because the 2 members he had been working toward had communicated to him through their own counsel that they would not support an emergency session that ran parallel to an active regulatory referral process. Without that support, the 14-day clock did not start. Without the 14-day clock, there was no ground to stand on. He was found on Friday morning in a service department 2 kilometers from his former office by a process server delivering the formal documentation of his suspension pending the board investigation. He had taken nothing from the building except his personal effects and a laptop that had already been remotely wiped by the time it left the building, which Dominic learned about from external IT security on Friday afternoon, and which he noted without escalating because the laptop's data had been replicated off-site before the suspension notification went out, a precaution that Clara had suggested when he had told her on Tuesday about the suspension notification's planned delivery method, and which he had implemented in the 40 minutes between her suggestion and the notification going out. She had thought of it because she thought of the things that were about to matter before they mattered. That was the specific quality of her attention, the particular texture of it. She was always 1 step ahead of the current moment, not because she was predicting, but because she was watching everything, which meant she saw what was coming before most people turned around. The meeting with Seok Jin-woo was on a Thursday in a coastal city where the light in the morning came off the water in long, flat sheets that made the conference facility's glass exterior look from outside like a held breath. They arrived separately as Clara had arranged, and Dominic was seated when she entered, and the arrangement of the room was exactly as she had described. And when Seok Jin-woo walked in with his 2 advisors, he took in the room in the way that powerful people take in rooms, rapidly and entirely. And his gaze rested on Clara for a moment longer than it rested on Dominic, which Dominic registered not as a slight, but as an accurate assessment of where the essential competence in the room was located. The meeting lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Dominic spoke for perhaps 30 of those minutes. The rest was a conversation conducted in 2 languages simultaneously, Korean through Clara and English through Dominic. But in practice, it was a conversation conducted in a single register, the register of people who were paying attention to the same thing and had, slowly, over the course of those 3 hours and 40 minutes, arrived at the understanding that what they were paying attention to was compatible. The Pacific Corridor Agreement was structured in principle by the end of the 3rd hour. The remaining 40 minutes were conversation, not negotiation, about the specific quality of the work both organizations valued and how it might be sustained. At one point, Seok Jin-woo looked directly at Clara and spoke to her in Korean, something he had not done in the preceding hours. She listened, and there was a pause, and then she responded briefly, and there was a pause on his side, and then he said something that made his 2 advisors look at each other with an expression that Dominic read, without understanding the language, as the expression of people who had not expected to hear that said, after the meeting, walking to the car, he asked her what Seok Jin-woo had said to her directly. She was quiet for a moment. He said, "Who taught you to listen like that?" And you said, "I said, no one taught me." I decided it was worth doing. He stopped walking. She continued 2 more steps and then stopped and turned back to look at him, the coastal light behind her making the moment very still. "What did he say to that?" Dominic asked. He said, That is rarer than you know." They stood there for a moment in the light off the water, the city going on around them, the agreement in principle signed, and the corridor open for the first time in 11 months, which was also the first time Dominic Calder had stood in a situation of his own making and understood fully what had been holding it together and what had been failing it. He said, "I owe you a real answer to the question you asked me in the facilities office." "I know," she said. "You have time to find it." She turned and continued to the car. "The timeline I'd suggest is 6 months." 6 months, he said, walking. "Demonstrated change over a defined period," she said. "Not promised, not announced, demonstrated." He nodded. This was fair. More than fair. It was, he thought, the only honest architecture for a beginning that was not pretending to be a conclusion. There was a public board meeting 6 weeks later at which Dominic made a statement about the company's internal governance and the circumstances that had allowed the irregularities to persist. He did not read from a prepared text. He spoke for 9 minutes and said, among other things, that the situation had been identified not by any executive or institutional mechanism within the company, but by a member of the building's overnight operational staff who had been paying attention to the right things for 3 years without recognition or formal channel, and that the company's proposed governance reforms included as their first element a restructuring of internal reporting access that would make what she had done unnecessary to do anonymously and impossible to ignore. He named her, not her title in the directory, not her role. Her name, Clara Voss. 2 words in a 9-minute statement, and they were the 2 words that several institutional shareholders and 2 journalists and one of the board members who had received Garrett Shin's Saturday morning call later said they remembered most clearly. The investigation concluded 4 months after that. The regulatory findings were formal and specific and led to consequences that were the appropriate institutional kind. Referrals, restrictions, civil proceedings, the measured weight of processes that do not move quickly, but do not stop either. Garrett Shin hired capable counsel and contested the findings across 2 jurisdictions. The documentation was thorough enough that contesting it was an exercise in delay rather than defense. Dominic did not attend those proceedings. He attended, instead, a series of operational reviews that Clara led, formally in a new role whose title in the company directory read Chief Operating Advisor, which was still not quite right, but was closer, and which she had agreed to on the condition that its scope and mandate were defined by the work rather than by the org chart, which he had agreed to because he was learning, slowly, that some agreements need to be structured around the thing itself rather than the category you put it in. The Pacific Corridor opened to operational traffic 8 months after the meeting on the coast. The numbers in the expansion plan, the ones that had been a blank space in a spreadsheet for 11 months, filled in over the following 2 quarters and then exceeded their projections by a margin that the analysts described, with their characteristic restraint, as meaningful. Clara read the analyst report in the facilities office on a Tuesday night, because she still worked nights, which was her preference, and the facilities office was still hers, which was her insistence. And the rest of the 43rd floor had gradually reorganized itself around the fact of her presence rather than the absence of her notice. She read it and set it aside and turned back to the monitors, because there were freight logs to review and maintenance schedules to verify, and a building full of people doing work that would matter in ways they could not yet see, and all of it deserved to be looked at properly, which was the principle she had decided on a long time ago, and which had not changed and would not change, because the principle was not conditional on being seen. Rarer than you know, Suk Jin-woo had said. She had not disagreed. She had only said, but not impossible, which was the truest thing about attention, about the kind that is not tactical or managed or performed, but simply given, absolutely and without the precondition of return. It is not impossible. It only requires deciding every day that the thing in front of you is worth the fullness of what you have to offer, whether or not anyone is counting, whether or not anyone will arrive, 11 months late, at a facilities office in the basement, and finally, look at what you have been building all along.